Howdy out there, folks. This is Darius Dale here to present our macro minute for Thursday, April 14th, 2022. Starting with markets, we have stocks mixed this morning with global equities leading, commodities mixed with crude oil lagging, crypto down, dollar down, global bond yields mixed with U.S. rates lagging European rates. Shifting to market moving headlines, you have Wells Fargo shares declined in pre market trading as revenue and net interest income missed analyst estimates, while expenses surprised to the upside. European bonds fell as the euro advanced into the ECB policy meeting, which is set to maintain its speedier withdrawal of stimulus. South Korea raised its key interest rate without a sitting governor, and Singapore further tightened policy, spurring advances in their currencies. The latest developments over the war include a European Union warning for member states. I mean, this is pretty harsh. That President Vladimir Putin's demand that quote unquote unfriendly countries effectively pay for Russian gas in rubles would be a violation of their existing sanctions. On the catalyst calendar this morning, we got U.S. retail sales out at 8:30, alongside jobless claims, inventories, and then University of Michigan consumer sentiment for the month of April on Thursday. Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester has been one of the more hawkish members for a while now. She's out speaking today as well, and then Patrick Harker is a little bit more centrist speaking as well. Big movers this morning: Japan's Nikkei 225 index up 1.2%. WTI minus 1%, and then the 10-year German bond yield up 5 basis points. Taking it to the charts this morning, you have the US dollar that is still bullish, fams, with minus 0.8% of downside in its probable range versus 1.1% of upside. Gold is neutral, vams, less of a fair fight than it had been in recent weeks, with minus 0.8% of downside versus 4.2% of upside. 10-year nominal Treasury yield that is still bullish, fams, with minus 26 basis points of downside versus 21 basis points of upside, so somewhat of a fair fight there. High yield OAS bullish, fams, bullish fams minus 29 basis points of downside versus 23 basis points of upside. So fair fight there as well. S&P 500, that is neutral, vams, minus 1.4% of downside versus 4.4% of upside. By the way, it's OPEX today. So we could get some strength into the close or some strength into, some strength into the close. Just be aware of that. 1.4% of downside versus 4.4% of upside. Oh, sorry, I mentioned that. The reason I mentioned that is because you have about 30 to 40% of index gamma expiring, and that allows dealers to unwind those hedges. We'll see if people want to put those hedges back on next week. So it's always an interesting dynamic in and around OPEX. But VIX still bearish, fams, here, minus 36% of downside versus 9% of upside. NASDAQ 100 neutral VAMs minus 1.7% of downside versus 7.4% of upside. Russell 2000 neutral VAMs minus 2.9% of downside versus 5.1% of upside. Bitcoin neutral VAMs minus 2% of downside in its probable range versus 15% of upside. Ethereum neutral VAMs minus 4% of downside in its probable range versus 16% of upside. China Shanghai Composite Index bearish VAMs still minus 5% of downside versus 1.9% of upside. WTI crude oil neutral VAMs minus 13% of downside versus 10.4% of upside. Kind of bounced off that line of truth that we talked about last week. We'll see if it continues to hold. And then ag here, it's overbought here. Neutral VAMs with only 0.2% of upside in its probable range versus 7.2% of downside. Industrial metals, neutral VAMs, basically a fair fight there, minus 3.8% of downside versus 4.4% of upside. With that, Darius Dale presenting our macro minute for Thursday, April 14th, 2022. We'll be off for Good Friday out there. Happy Easter to everyone who celebrates. Thank you and God bless. Appreciate you.